right, exposure. Years ago when I got a camcorder, it was pretty simple. There was exposure. I actually set exposure on the screen, and I could go up exposure or down exposure manually when I wanted to control it manually. Life was pretty simple. Then I got, my first DSLR, and I'm like looking at it, I'm like, where's the word exposure? There's no exposure up, no exposure down. How do I adjust exposure? I kind of understood the concept exposure is brightness, so how do I control the brightness? Well, to let you know, there's basically three things that make up exposure. You're not going to see the word exposure on there unless you're looking at exposure compensation, which you're probably in AV or TV mode, and you should stay away from that. When we're shooting full manual, we're adjusting exposure with three different things, and they form a triangle, and we're going to go through each one individually in great detail. But basically there is ISO, there's shutter speed, and there's aperture. So before we start talking about exposure, we really have to start with metering first. There's, on the still side of things, we have four different metering types. There's evaluative, there's spot, there's partial, and there's center weighted average. On the video side of things, we just have center weighted average. All right, pretty much when it comes to metering, all cameras, from my understanding, are pretty much set up the same way. Especially, on the Canon cameras, they're pretty much calibrated, I guess you could say, to 18% gray. So when it sees a scene, or if I were to fill the frame with just this, and I got the meter right in the middle, it's going to say, hey, you've properly exposed. That's what it's kind of set up for. Let me kind of demonstrate this. So if we turn the camera on to video mode, and we can see we have a very bright scene, just shooting out the window here. And down here is your meter. So this is basically in the middle, that middle tick mark. If it was right there, it was saying, hey, we've got a properly exposed image. And if you don't see a tick mark, and you won't when you first turn it on, you pretty much just have to press the shutter halfway down. And you can see right here, it's either 3 or greater than 3 stops above what it feels is properly exposed. Well, in this situation where, let's say I didn't care about the background and I want to create a foreground object, let's say this 18% gray card, and if I put it right in the frame, you will notice that now the tick mark appears and it's set right at the center, right in the middle, at a 50th of a second, 4.5, and I'm using an ISO of 800 for the lighting that I have here. So that's just saying that I have a properly exposed image. So a great example of this is, as you can see, what's going on outside is mostly clipped. And we have no detail information in the highlights, what's going on outside. A great example of this is, here's our talent sitting at a table. And you can see that the windows are totally blown out, but I used an 18% gray card before my talent got there, and I set it up to properly exposed for her skin and her shirt. You can see we have lots of great detail, and it's set up for the lighting that within the room, not for the lighting that's outside. So I kind of pretty much had to make a judgment call and say, hey, what's more important, the talent or what's going on outside? So pretty much the meter is just basically a tool. It's just going to get us close. We have to do some other things to get us even closer, and we're going to be discussing some other tools to help us along the way. All right, before we start talking about shutter speed, I want to talk about exposure, how important it is. You have to really nail the exposure. You could be maybe a third of a stop under, a third of a stop over the exposure that you want. That'll be pretty close, but if you start getting a stop over or under, then things start being nasty and really hard to fix in post. So let me demonstrate this. Here I am down in my studio. It's kind of a high contrast shot, which I wanted to try just one light. And what I did is I used a digital calibration target, which has 18% gray, and I put that 18% gray right in the middle of the histogram. And then what I've got here is, on the left-hand side, I've got evenly exposed on the left, and I've got one stop underexposed on the right. Now you'll notice on the right, the skin starts getting this kind of reddish tint to it, and it has almost looks a little bit sunburned sometimes when you underexpose. Now if I go 2/3 of a stop underexposed, it's starting to look a little bit better, but it still doesn't look quite right. And then 1/3 of a stop, actually looks very good. I could have used the third of a stop down. In fact, a lot of the times what I'll do, if the even exposure looks too bright, I'll actually back it down a third of a stop. And I'll show you why here in a second. Now when we go third of a stop overexposed, we start losing not skin texture, but the skin tone itself actually starts going away. It's looking more white. Here's 2/3 of a stop, and when we have a full stop, which is way too bright. Now what happens here is, let's say you've gone out and you've shot something overexposed, especially when it comes to a person or a skin tone. When you go to try to recover it, here what I've done is I used the waveform and I've matched the two as best I could. And they matched that actually quite well in terms of levels. But what you'll notice here is my skin tone is now less saturated on the right-hand side. And also, by bringing up some of these levels, I have introduced noise into the black background as well. Stepping to 2/3 of a stop, it's starting to look better, but not as saturated in the skin tones. And then we've got a third of a stop, is looking pretty darn good, actually. So if you're like a third of a stop above or a third of a stop below, it works pretty well. Now we'll go to 2/3 of a stop over. Now the skin is kind of taking on this, how do I describe it? Here, let me show you one stop overexposed. One stop, trying to fix that is really hard. I can't tell you how many times I've done it myself, where I've been outside just filming myself and the clouds are in when I started recording, and then all of a sudden the clouds went away and the sun's shining directly on my face, and I'm like at least a stop over exposed, and then trying to fix it in post, you get this kind of effect. And I don't know what the term is, but when you try to correct it, you get this kind of like a terracotta color, like a pot that you put plants into has that kind of terracotta color and texture. And that's kind of what happens to your skin, is when you're way overexposed and you try to bring it down, you get that kind of look. So again, I just want to talk about the importance of exposure. And if you're going to be, my rule of thumb is, try to nail it as best you can. If you're a third of a stop below, I think you're totally fine, but try to get as best you can, and it'll make your images look so much better. All right, shutter speed, ISO, and aperture are all related. They kind of form a triangle in terms of exposure. All I want you to know for right now is they are related, and I'm going to demonstrate how they're related later on. So first up is shutter speed, and I think shutter speed is probably the easiest one to start with because it's almost a set and forget type thing. I'd say the majority of the time I'm shooting at a 50th of a second. Sometimes I shoot at a 60th of a second. Sometimes I shoot at 125th of a second. Sometimes I even shoot higher than that with shutter speed. All right, so let's talk about where I came up with the numbers 50th of a second, 60th of a second, and 125th of a second. Those are the ones I most commonly use. Before we talk about, we got to talk about frame rates. So movies, 24 frames per second, video, TV, broadcast, 30 frames per second for the most part. So I myself personally shoot at 24 frames per second, and the main reason I do, I kind of like the film look, but really when it comes down to it is when you're publishing to the web like I do, almost exclusively. In fact, I've never had anything on TV that have been broadcast that I know of. But basically what happens is when you upload to YouTube, Vimeo, Blip TV, all of them, no matter what frame rate you shot it in and then you put it into your timeline, let's say it was 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second, they're all going to retranscode it. They're all going to reconform it basically down to 24 frames. Because for them, it's much easier to do that. It's less computer intensive, and for your smartphone, your computer, 24 frames a second, it's easier to do on the web than 30 frames per second. So step one in terms of picking my shutter speed is I pick my frames per second. So if I'm shooting at, let's say 1080, 24 frames per second, I'm going to double it. So that's 48th of a second shutter speed. There is no 48th shutter speed on the Canon cameras, so I picked the next best thing, which is 50th of a second. So why double the frame rate to get the shutter speed? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to how cameras used to work, and they used to use their rotary shutter. And to demonstrate this, I'll show you this little thing I created. And basically the square rectangle is your frame, and the CD that I've got is the rotary shutter. So as you see, as I rotate the rotary shutter, that half the time the frame is exposed and half the time it's not. And there's a term for this, and it's called the 180-degree shutter rule. And basically, when you look at a circle, it's 360 degrees, and if you chop it in half, you get 180 degrees. And that's what's happening, is half the time the shutter, half the time the frame is exposed, and half the time it's not. So if we do a little math and we take 1/24 and we divide by 2, we get 1/48, or in our case, the Canon camera's 1/50th of a second shutter speed. All right, so what does a shutter speed of 1/50th look like for your videos? So let me demonstrate. Here I am golfing in my backyard, and you'll notice when I swing and then I freeze the frame, you can't see the golf club at all. It's totally gone. But then when I take it and then I increase the shutter speed from 50th of a second to 1,000th of a second, and I stop it, you can see now that you can actually see the golf club. And then just to demonstrate on slow motion, where I shot this at 60 frames per second and I slowed it down to 24 frames per second in my timeline, you can see that the amount of blur on the golf club is the same as when I shot it at a 50th of a second. So I'm using the same 180-degree shutter rule for the slow motion as I am for the regular speed. So I don't always shoot at 50th of a second or always follow the 180-degree rule. There's sometimes when I do some action, it's pretty rare, but if I have an action scene, because I don't do that much action, I will film at maybe 2/50th or 500 to give that more staccato, choppy look, technical look, and it adds, especially in a chase scene or something like that, it adds a lot of more edginess to it, and it helps your viewer feel like they're actually in the action. Another reason I will change the shutter speed is when I'm in, let's say, an environment with a lot of fluorescent lights, or maybe some even cheaper LED lights, when you start getting what's called banding. And so what I'll do is I'll actually play with the shutter speed, because some of those are based off the frequency. So I'll actually, instead of shooting at a 50th of a second, I might go down to a 30th or try a 40th. I might go up to a 60th, an 80th. I'll play around with it until I find where that banding kind of goes away and it's not present with those cheaper fluorescent lights. Okay, shutter speed as it pertains to exposure. As you can see here, I'm starting out at a 50th of a second and I'm working my way up in terms of shutter speed. I'm going up to like 2,000ths or 4,000ths of a second, and it makes it a lot darker. On the reverse side, if you go from a 50th and you go down, you can do a 40th and you can do a 30th. So it gives you a third of a stop or 2/3 of a stop more light. So if you're in a situation where you're like this, and the person, let's say, doesn't talk with their hands much and waving their arms around, and it's basically just a talking head like this, go down to a 30th of a second. If you need more light, let's say your lens won't let you go farther. Let's say it goes only down to 5.6 and you need just 2 more thirds of stop of light. Go down to a 30th of a second. Not a problem, because you're not going to see much difference in terms of motion blur of the person talking like I am. So the other thing I want to talk about is there's really no right or wrong shutter speed. And it just, use whatever you want, play around with it, and you'll get an understanding. Sure, a 50th of a second or using the 180-degree rule will get you close, get you started, because even if we were to follow the rule, we should be at a 48th of a second. We're going to a 50th of a second. So play around with it, have some fun. A great exercise for you guys to do is go out to like a water fountain and just turn it on, and as the water arcs, shoot it at like a 50th of a second, and also shoot it at a high shutter speed and see what happens. Or water passing by in a river. Just try a lot of different examples and you'll get an idea of what that shutter is doing to your image and how it makes you feel when you watch it. So that's pretty much it for shutter speed. All right, really quickly, I want to talk about slow motion in the post-production workflow. Again, we're really not talking about computers and nonlinear editors in this course because it goes well beyond the scope of this course, but really quick, I want to tell you, when we're shooting for slow motion, we're shooting at 60 frames per second, which is 720p, and let's say you've increased your shutter to 1/25th of a second to get that nice consistent motion blur. Basically what we do is we've taken 60 frames, and we don't need all 60 frames per second. You know, you could do it in 24 frames per second, but we've got all these extra frames in there, and what we can do with it is when we put it on the timeline, we can then take it and stretch it out. So you're going from 60 frames and you're stretching it all the way to 24 frames on the 24 frame timeline. So basically when you're doing that is you're getting silky smooth slow motion. Because if you do try to do the same thing, you put a clip on the timeline that's shot at 24 frames a second, like 1080, and then you try to almost double the length of the clip like you do with the 60 frames per second, you're going to get really choppy, kind of not very fluid slow motion. But when you put the 60 frames per second on the timeline, you won't, kind of double it. You're going to get this very fluid slow motion. So again, I don't really want to show you how to do it because it goes well beyond the scope of this course, but I know I keep talking about slow motion because I just wanted to tell you, basically bring it on the timeline and then do the calculations to go from 60 frames down to 24. A lot of times you don't even have to do the calculation. If you're in Premiere Pro, you just say reinterpret the footage from 60 down to 23,976, 23.976, and it'll give you that beautiful slow motion. ISO. So what is ISO? ISO is a measurement of your camera's sensitivity to light. All right, sounds really technical. So what exactly does that all mean? Think of it this way. You all have probably access to a stereo system. If you were to play music and then you turn the volume all the way down while the music's playing, you put your ear up to the speaker, you're not going to hear anything. Obviously, you turn up the volume, it gets louder. You put your ear up to it, definitely gets louder. But the same thing applies with your camera's sensor. As you apply more ISO, the higher the number goes, the more bright your image becomes. And just as with music, as if you were to play music, turn the volume up and hit pause the music and put your ear up to the speaker, you're going to be able to hear a whole bunch of background hiss and noise, depending how good your amplifier is. And the same thing applies with your camera's sensor. The higher you go with the ISO number, let's say 6400 for instance, you look at the image, you're going to start to notice more and more noise creep into your image. All right, of the three elements that make up exposure, ISO is one that can degrade your image. It changes the exposure, and it doesn't really give you anything creatively, unless you like noise as a creative element. But shutter speed, as we talked about earlier, can give you a certain look in terms of motion blur. And f-stop, or aperture, we're going to be talking about next, that one will definitely give you a different look as you raise or lower the number, and it also changes the exposure. So ISO, really have to pay attention to it. If you don't like the look of grain or noise, definitely you want to shoot with a lot of things in mind, from contrast to lighting, a lot of stuff we're going to be talking about here in a second. So the first thing I want to show you is what I did is I took the camera, I put the lens cap on, and I shot just darkness. All the way from 100 to 6400 ISO. And as you can see on the screen here, you can see at 6400 on the far right. And sometimes what you have to do is, depending on your monitor and how it's set, or what type of monitor you have, sometimes you have to change your angle of the screen, maybe 10 or 15 degrees to be able to see some of this noise. And I have stretched the image a little bit to exaggerate this so you can see it a little bit better. So on the left-hand side, ISO is 100 is going to look a little bit noisier than it actually is. So looking at 6400, you can definitely see some noise. 3200, 1600 you can see some, and then after you get down to about 800, the noise pretty much goes away on this particular test. And as we can see on the screen here, we can see that the ISO numbers from left to right are doubling. We go from 100, 200, 400, etc. And they double. And what's happening here is they're all going up one stop, which is very different from our aperture and our shutter speed adjustments, which go up in 1/3 of a stop increments. On the Rebel line of cameras, this is all we have for ISO increasing each step is one full stop. So how hard or how high can you push the ISO before it becomes unusable, too noisy basically? It's just as a guideline, I usually don't go above 1600 in these particular Rebel line of cameras. All these cameras from the Canon 7D all the way up to the T4i or the T3i, they're all basically have the same APS-C sensor, and they all react to low light situations in a very similar manner. So if I need to, I'll go to 3200 like in this shot right here. I was using cheaper glass and I was zoomed all the way in. It was at 5.6, so I had to go to 3200 to get the exposure right. Sometimes if I really need to, I'll go to 6400. If I really have to get the shot and I don't mind the noise, I'll definitely go up to 6400. But just as a guideline, try to not go above 1600. So basically when I'm outside and I've got lots of light, or I'm in a studio situation and I've got access to a ton of light, you want to go to the lowest ISO as you can. And on this particular camera, it's ISO 100. So when you get into mixed lighting situations, or let's say you've got light coming in from outside and you're lighting, I've got some light set up right here, you might go to ISO 200. And then you get into more situations where you have even less light, or it's getting darker outside, maybe it's evening. Maybe you go from 400 to 800. It all depends, and it's a relationship between your shutter speed and your aperture. I'm going to be talking about all those relationships later, but just as a guideline, if you've got lots of light, go to ISO 100, you'll get the cleanest image. All right, next up I want to show you two video clips. Which one do you think is shot at a higher ISO? You might be thinking the one on the left, but they're actually both shot at the same ISO. So why does one look noisier than the other? Well, in this situation, the one on the left, I've evenly lit on both sides of the lens, and the one on the right, I'm just lighting on one side. It's kind of a higher contrast situation. So why is one noisier than the other? Is it because of the contrast? Actually, it's not. That's what I originally thought a while back, but it actually has to do with this area right in here where it says 50 millimeters, where it's transitioning from a very light to a very dark. There's not much of that area that's at a certain darkness. Well, on the left-hand side, pretty much the whole entire lens has that darkness. And what I'm going to do next to demonstrate this is let's take a look at a color chart. And basically I've eliminated the color, and all I have here is just these shades of gray. Actually, the one on the right should be white and the one on the left is black. But what you'll notice, which one of these gray panels is the noisiest? And what happens is it's not so much the black, and it's definitely not the white. I can hardly see anything, and I'm shooting this at 6400 ISO. The one that to me is the noisiest is the second darkest. So what we want to take a look at next is the one on the left here is our lens with the low contrast situation, and the one on the right is the darker color. So I basically just crop those images, and I'm looking at it on the waveform monitor. And this particular scope is showing us in terms of IRE, or in terms of lightness or darkness, showing us where that part of the image is occurring. And as you can see, it's pretty much between 20 and maybe 35 IRE. So that's where the noisiest part of the image is. So if we go back to the lens example, you'll see that on the left here, a lot of it's residing around 20 to 30, or maybe 10 to 30 IRE. But over here on the right, you'll notice that the transition between dark to light is going very rapidly, and there's not much, hardly any of the picture is in that 20 to 30 IRE range. So it's not about contrast, it's about where how much of the image is in that particular range in terms of IRE. To give you a really good example of this, take a look at this shot at 6400, me down in my studio, and I've got a white background, but I purposely lit it in such a way where the white background is sitting in that area of that 20 to 30 IRE. And you can see it's really noisy. Now if we change it and we go to a black background, all I did is I changed the white sheet to a black bed sheet. And all of a sudden, the image looks a lot cleaner. And again, we're still shooting at the same 6400 ISO. And then when we do a high key situation, it looks clean again. And the reason is, if we go back to where we were originally, all of that gray area, or that dark gray, that 20 to 30 IRE, maybe 35 IRE, is basically where all that noise really starts to accumulate. So as you're shooting, just keep that in mind. If you want to shoot at really high ISOs like 6400, make sure a lot of your scene does not have that 20 to 30 IRE kind of area built into it. All right, take a look at this next shot. And you might be thinking this is shot at like ISO maybe 100, 400, because I'm not seeing any noise at all. But this is actually shot at ISO 1600, and it looks so clean. So why does it look so clean? Look at the waveform monitor. Basically, we have hardly anything residing in the 20 to 35 IRE range. There's nothing there, so nothing is making it look really noisy. It looks actually quite clean. So again, this is another example. If you're going to shoot at a high ISO, make sure you don't have a ton of your frame or ton of your image having a lot of those darker grays. All right, some of you might be still thinking it has more to do with contrast than it has to do with this 20 to 35 IRE range. So let me show you an example. And I'm going to get ahead of myself just a little bit here with picture styles, but hold on, because we're going to explain picture styles in great detail later. But let me show you something. Looking at the screen here, this is the neutral picture style, which is a very low contrast image. And then boom, we've got the standard picture style. To me, that looks noisier. And the reason because it looks noisier is because it's shifting more contrast, or it's adding more contrast, and it's shifting more of the shadows into that kind of 20 to 35 IRE range. Let's take a look at another example. Let's go to our low key situation where we've got a black background, and now that's neutral, and then we're going to switch right here to standard. And again, you've got more, they're shot at the exact same exposure. All I was doing is changing the picture style, and we're all at 6400. Now let's take a look at the high key environment, and then especially look under like my chin when we go to standard. You can see the shadow under the chin has shifted that, the contrast has shifted that area down lower to where it's more noisy. So it doesn't have to do with contrast. It kind of does in a way, but it's more of, think about it in terms of what's living in that 20 to 35 IRE range. And we're going to talk more about waveform monitors and stuff like that, which is kind of well beyond the scope of this course, since this is a beginning course. But I wanted to tell you guys, if you want to shoot really clean images at high ISO, you really have to look out what's going on in the frame in terms of that area of darkness. All right, before we move on to aperture, let's recap. Shutter speed does basically two things. You've got exposure control, and you got somewhat of a creative control when it comes to how much motion blur you want, in terms of how you want a lot of motion blur or very little motion blur. ISO basically does only one thing, and that would be exposure control. It does have the extra added feature of noise, which you kind of want to stay away from unless that's the kind of look you want to go for. And then aperture does two things as well. It basically does exposure control, and probably the most important, to me anyway, the most creative thing that you get out of these type of DSLR cameras is the shallow depth of field. This shot, for instance, is shot at 1.8, and you can see it has a very pleasing bokeh. Basically, bokeh is how items look out of focus, and these circles that you see are basic, and you've seen it just probably in about every movie, are basically Christmas lights way out of focus, and they create this very large circle. And it's not just for Christmas lights, it's other things. It's how When you're shooting somebody with trees in the background, for instance, and light maybe streaming through it, and you put the trees way out of focus, and you just focus on the person that you're interviewing that's very close to you, those trees with that light coming through can create a very pleasing bokeh as well. It's not just Christmas lights. Then if we compare it to what it looks like at 5.6, you can see that the bokeh, or the size of the Christmas lights have gone down dramatically in terms of how out of focus they are, because now the depth of field is increasing. We don't have a very shallow depth of field, we have a very long or large depth of field. I don't even really like the term depth of field. I think it's very confusing for people that are beginning. I know when I first started, it was like, depth of field? What? I would call it depth of focus, and I think other people have called it depth of focus. Now, if you look at this shot, this is a really good example. This is just basically a texture, a carpet, and this is a great exercise for you guys to do to learn how shallow, open up your lens wide open. And that's a term we can talk about really quickly. A lot of people are going to say wide open. And when you're shooting wide open, that means that the blades, the aperture is as wide as it can be. And basically, to define aperture, if you don't know by now, is basically how much light is allowed into the lens. And it's restricted by those blades, or it can be unrestricted by just bringing it wide open. Another couple terms really quick. People are going to refer to fast glass. Typically, if you have a cheaper zoom, it's not really considered fast glass because it's a very slow lens. It can only go to, let's say, 5.6 if you zoom all the way out. Another term is stopping down. When people say stopping down, they refer to taking those blades and restricting them down. That's called stopping down. And then wide open, again, is opening that aperture all the way up. So it can be very confusing when you're first starting. You think, well, I've got an f/22 and I've got a f/1.8. Isn't the 22 wide open? No, it's not. That's backwards. And that's the way I kind of thought when I first picked up my camera. It's kind of counterintuitive. The best way I can describe it to you, but maybe that you can remember it, is think of a swimming pool. I listened to a podcast with Silverine, and he gave this analogy, and I think it's really quite good. Basically, if you look at a swimming pool and you think of the shallow end as your, let's say, your 1.8 or 2.8 that your lens can do, and then you look at the deep end, which is like an f/22, let's say, the deep end has a lot of water in it. So the amount of things that are in focus, the depth of the pool is very large. Whereas you go to the very shallow end, let's say it's one of those really, those pools that have a gradual grade. At the very end, you have a very just a little bit of water. Well, that is it's your 1.8 or 2.8. It's very shallow. So that might be a way for you guys to remember it. Sometimes I get lots of questions like, Dave, what aperture did you shoot that at? Or what did you do here? Or what did you do there? Kind of thing. And I want to tell you there's really no right or wrong aperture. It's just like shutter speed. There's no right or wrong. Whatever looks good to you. So basically, if you're trying to separate somebody from the background and you want to concentrate if that part of the story or whatever you're doing, maybe you're doing an interview and you want that person to just know what that person's talking about, and you want to take all the distractions away from the background, basically. A great thing to do is shoot at a very narrow depth of field, shallow depth of field. Maybe like a 3.2, maybe even a 2.8 if the person's not moving much. Right now, I am filming myself at 3.2 because I know personally I'm not going to move much in this chair. If you're interviewing somebody that moves around a lot, I would suggest bumping that up maybe to a 5.6. A great way to do this is the punch-in tool that we talked about earlier. So basically when you've got the person doing an interview, tell them to move around, lean in, lean out as much as they're going to do in the interview. So they might say, well, I might lean forward a little bit to make my point, and I might lean back to be more, think about something. And then when they do that, make sure that punch in and look right at their eye, and make sure that it's in focus there. And then when they lean in, and then they maybe take their glasses off and they make a dramatic point, that when they lean in a little bit, that their eye is also in focus. And that might be 5.6. That's a great place to start. For me, I know just from years of doing this, I don't move that much in my chair, and I could easily go down to 2.8 and I'll still and I focus right on one of my eyes, usually the eye that's closest to the camera. Because once you get to like 1.8, which I wouldn't recommend doing that, that's just way too, or 1.4 or 1.2, that becomes so narrow. Just the distance between your eyelash and your, the reflective part of your eye, those two things can be different in terms of focus. It's wafer thin. It's not waffle thin, it's like wafer thin. As you can see here by moving up and down the carpet, zoomed in, we could see that the tape measure, it doesn't take much. You just move that focus ring a little bit and it changes the focus dramatically. So you can be quite out of focus just by tapping your lens at 1.4. All right, pretty much we've been talking about this lens. It's the 50 millimeter 1.8. I love it. It's cheap. If you're really low on cash and you haven't bought one yet, go pick one up. Awesome lens. Beautiful bokeh, super sharp. Has a little bit of vignetting when you're shooting wide open, but not too bad. So there's a 1.4 version of this. It's a lot more. It's like 3 times more expensive. The big benefit of that one, it has a larger focus ring. So if you're pulling focus a lot, definitely get that lens in if you got the cash. All right, so we've been talking about primes. This is a prime, meaning it's not a zoom. So we need to now go to another type of lens, and that is the zoom. This is a very large zoom. And when you get large and expensive glass, usually means one thing, that it's constant or fixed aperture throughout the entire zoom range on the minimum number. And when we say minimum, that's the lowest aperture, how wide open it is. This one is at 2.8, so I can zoom from 70 all the way to 200 at 2.8 and nothing will happen to the blades inside of for the aperture, which is wonderful. The downside is it's heavier and it's a lot more expensive. Now, if you're going with a cheaper, this is a much cheaper lens. It's a zoom lens. It's the 28 to 135. It's a great all-around lens, a great travel lens. I've used it a ton. It's fairly sharp, and it has really good image stabilization, which I like. But the problem with this, and especially for beginners, is what happens is the thing that kind of trips you up a little bit is when you're at 28 or even to about 35, I think it happens, you can shoot at this minimum aperture, which is 3.5. And then, because it'll be written on the lens what the range is. And then if I can find the label real quick. Oh, it's right here. So it's 3.5 to 5.6, meaning that you're going to get a difference. It's not constant, it's not fixed aperture. So when I zoom from all the way to 28 to 135, what's gonna happen is when I start out at 28, it'll be 3.5, but by the time I get to 135, it'll have stopped down. The blades will have gotten constricted to 5.6. And you can see that here in this demonstration with the gray card. As I zoom in, you'll see that it gets darker. So one of the things you could just say to yourself is, well, I really shouldn't be zooming while I'm filming. I should just stop recording, reposition, and get the next shot. Typically, I don't ever zoom. It's very rare that I zoom while I'm filming. All right, just a few recommendations to get you started. When you're going outside and it's a bright sunny day and you're shooting a 50th of a second in ISO 100, you're typically going to be around, at least in Colorado, you're going to be around f/16. It's a great place to start. If you want to go down from there and it's a really sunny day, you're going to need to put an ND filter on it. And again, we're not really talking about extra accessories here, but if you want to be shooting at like a 3.5 on a bright sunny day, you're going to need to screw on an ND filter or some sort of sunglasses, basically, for your lens, so you can basically open up the lens at a wider aperture. All right, and then when you move inside, a great place to start, depending on your lighting situation, obviously, but you're going to be like maybe at a 5.6 is a great place to start, and your ISO might be at ISO 400. If it gets really dimly lit, maybe you're going down to 2.8 if your lens can actually do that. So the depth of field is also related to a couple other things, how much you're zooming and the distance. For instance, and how, because if you're shooting at a very wide angle lens, let's say, For instance, like the GoPro. I have a GoPro, and I was shooting a time lapse, and it was super wide and it was super sunny, and the darn thing was shooting at f2.8 and everything was in focus. Why? Because I was shooting at such a wide angle lens. And if I'm shooting at 24 on a full frame camera, which is much wider than we talked about on a crop sensor camera, again, a lot of things are going to be in focus past 5 or 6 feet from the camera. So if you're shooting at, let's say, 1.4 and it's very dimly lit, but your subject, let's say, is 50 feet away, well, they can move in and out of focus. It's going to take them a bit. But if they're like 2 feet from the camera, let's say this particular lens, I can go as close as 1.5 feet. So if I have my subject 1.5 feet away from this camera, if they move just a few millimeters, they're going to be out of focus. It doesn't take much at all. So it's dependent on your distance. So again, if let's say you're doing an interview and the person's, let's say, typically 8 feet away from the camera, or I'm right here, I'm about maybe 5 feet from the camera, but let's say they're about 7 feet from the camera, they can move a little bit, and depending on how much you're zoomed and what your f-stop is. So it's something that you're going to just have to play with. I just can't give you all the scenarios because there's too many. There's too many variables. The zoom, the distance, and your f-stop. All right, histogram. It's actually easier than it looks. I'm shooting a digital calibration target. We got black, 18% gray, and white. And right here is our histogram. And if you don't see it, just basically keep hitting the info button until you see your histogram pop up. So we've got on the left-hand side, let me go through the different axes. Along the bottom axis is your brightness. And so to really demonstrate this quite easily, I'm going to zoom in just on the gray. And you're going to see a whole bunch of pixels going on right there with the gray. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start rotating it. And what you're going to see happen is I'm going more and more. This is our white spike right here. This is our white that's coming into the picture. And you see there's more and more pixels going there. And now there's going to be less and less pixels until we get right here to where we don't have any more gray pixels and everything is white. So as I'm moving it around, and we'll go show you black, you'll see a big spike on the black as well. I've got 2 spikes. So what this bottom axis is showing, as you can see as I move around, is just basically the brightness. And then the upper axis we've got right here, going up and down, this is the amount of pixels we've got. So we can see we've got a whole bunch of pixels gray, and we've got some white pixels. Now, if you're coming from an audio background like I am, you will see that right up here at the top, it looks like it's chopped off. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, if it's audio related, we're clipping those pixels. Well, you're not. Don't worry about it. It's just showing that I've got so many pixels in this area that I can't display them all the way this graph is displayed. So, but what you do have to worry about, and think of audio kind of rotated 90 degrees, where you do have to worry most about is over here on the right hand side, this part right here. And to demonstrate that, so let me zoom back out again. So we got our black, neutral gray, and white. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the ISO and I'm going to bring this to 800. And we're going to go back, and then all of a sudden we notice that the blacks shifted to the right, the grays shifted to the right, and now we have no whites on the screen. So this white area you see right here has no information in it. It's totally lost. So if I were to take the exposure and I press the AV button in, and I take the main dial and I rotate it to the right, now I am increasing the f-stop number of the aperture, which we'll be getting into more later. And now, once we got to f6.3, we can see now that we've got nothing is along this line. What you want to worry about is when you see this. Let's go back down to, let's say, 5.6. And you can see right here, along this axis, now we can't see that is clipping right here. We don't see that perfect spike coming down anymore. So we're actually losing detail. And we're going to show you some other tools later on show you where exactly in the image it's clipping. But for right now, this shows you that you've got something clipping. So that's pretty much the histogram. A great tool that we have at our disposal when you have time to really nail the exposure. All right, next up we're going to talk about contrast and how it can affect your exposure. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm shooting in neutral picture style right now. I'm going to shoot a few seconds of video, and I've got the contrast turned all the way down. And when I hit the play button, we get to see the histogram again of what it recorded for that particular frame that we're on right now. And then the image over here looks pretty good and it gives all our information. As we can see, we shot it in neutral with the contrast down at a -4. So what I'm going to do now is go to quick menu, and we're going to go and choose standard picture style. And the standard picture style is set at 0, not meaning all the way down like -4, but 0 is like right in the middle. So now I'm going to go back out of here and record a few seconds and stop and hit play. And you're going to notice two things have happened. Over here on the right, you'll notice that what's happened with the contrast is the histogram, the black and the whites have pulled out farther. Whereas the neutral, the black and white spikes were pushed in more on the histogram. And then what we're also noticing is what's called the highlight alert, or the blinkies. And what we're seeing right here is when you've all the white is gone, you have no detail basically left in the white, and you've clipped it, it's going to actually show you not only you are clipping, but it's going to show you where in the image you're clipping. So one of the big points I want to make here is that shooting in different picture styles can definitely affect your exposure. So if you're going to be using neutral, set your exposure for neutral, then don't change to standard. Or if you're in standard, just set your exposure there and stay there. Especially if you think you're about to lose some information in the highlights that you don't want to lose. Obviously, like the example I gave before where the talent was in front of a window, I didn't care what was clipped on the window because I had to make a judgment call of what was going on with her shirt and her face. So definitely keep that in mind when you're shooting with different picture styles and how it can affect your exposure. All right, I want to show you how I set up exposure when I have time. Obviously, there's a lot of times when I do run and gun shooting and I just don't have time to do this. And I want to pretty much nail the exposure the best I can. If you're in a studio situation and you're on set and you've got the time, definitely set up a digital calibration target, and while you're there setting exposure, get the white balance as well. So let me show you what I typically do. Now you got to be careful because with these lights, you don't want to block the light. So if I have the target set up and I start walking towards it to help kind of fill the frame, if I get in front of one of the lights, well, that's kind of blocking the light and we're not going to get accurate results. So basically, I try to, if I can zoom in, that works. Now you got to be careful because like this particular lens is it's not a constant aperture lens. It goes from 3.5 to 5.6. So if I'm zooming all the way in, I set my exposure at 3.5 at the beginning, and then I zoom all the way in, all of a sudden it's going to stop down to 5.6. So that's not a good thing. And what I'm going to do for this demonstration purposes, I'm going to be well above that, so I'm not going to run into that situation. See, because right now I'm at f8, and I'm still at f8. I'm zooming all the way out and zooming all the way in, and I'm still at f8. Now, if I were down at around 3.6, that would be changing up to 3.5 to 5.6. Okay, so now remember, the meter down here is based off of center weighted average. So if I just basically fill the frame, the center weighted average meter at the bottom here is saying that I'm a stop too bright. But I'm looking at the histogram and I'm saying, damn, I look pretty good. There's two things I usually look at, is the spike in the middle and then the spike to the right, the highlights. I want to make sure the highlights aren't clipping, and I want to make sure that that neutral gray is right in the middle, or as close to the middle as I can get. And if I'd rather be a little bit to the left underexposed than I would be a little bit to the right overexposed. So looking at this again, this meter down here, center weighted average, is not being very accurate tool for us, but the histogram in this case is being very accurate. So now I could zoom in more and fill the frame. And then look what happens. Now all of a sudden our center weighted average meter down here is saying that we're a little bit too bright. So if I bring this to F9, now the center weighted average meter is saying, hey, you're right on. And if we look at the histogram that says we're a little bit to the left. So this is probably the most accurate way to do it, is to fill the frame with gray and use it that way. Or you can just use the histogram. If you can't, like I said, sometimes there are going to be situations where you're going to be blocking light. You don't want to do that. Or there'll be some situations where you can't zoom in because you'll be going from 3.5 to 5.6 on the zoom. So this is kind of how I set it up. It's definitely well worth the time if you've got the time. If you're running and gunning, obviously you won't be able to do this. All right, let's talk about B-roll. A lot of times with B-roll, you're not going to have time to set up a digital calibration target. Totally understand that. You're running and gunning, you're trying to get the job done. Let's say you're doing a corporate interview. If you don't know what B-roll is, you sat down with the CEO of a refinery, let's say, and he's talking about all his refineries or whatever. And so you go out and after the interview's done and you shoot B-roll of the refineries. Get a lot of different locations, different cuts, so you can intercut into the interview really well. So what's great about B-roll in these cameras is you can just shoot at the exposure you think is correct and then underexpose a third of a stop for like 10 seconds and then do the same clip overexpose a third of a stop for like 10 seconds. And then what I've noticed over the years of doing that, I don't do it as much anymore, but I sometimes will I usually don't choose the overexposed one that much because you've got 3 to choose from, and you'll be looking at your nonlinear editor and you'll be like, oh, I wish I had shot it this way a little bit. Well, you did. You shot it 3 different ways, so you can go in and try one or try the other, and which one you can get the best results out of. So definitely a great practice if you're shooting lots of B-roll and you don't have time to set up a digital calibration target. Next up, I want to talk about squeezing as much information as we can into the camera and then extracting it out in post. And when I say squeezing in, the best way is when you look at the histogram, you squeeze it in and then you extract it out. So let me give you an example. Right now, to show you, I am shooting, we're going to shoot at the neutral picture style with the contrast turned all the way down. So if we look at the histogram, we can see the white and the blacks they're not, they're safely within the margin of clipping. So we've got lots of room. So now if we go to the quick menu and we change it to standard, and we see that the standard, the contrast, that second number is at 0, the default. And then now notice that the white and the blacks are very close to getting to the edges of clipping. So the concept I want to tell you here is, by squeezing it in, like you think of the histogram, we're squeezing it in, and then later we're pulling it out in post if we need to. I'd say 90% of the time I don't really need to. There is some situations where I do need to set the white point and the black point within the nonlinear editor, and that's kind of getting too advanced for this beginner level course. So the main concept I want to talk about here is if you shoot with a standard picture style with your contrast set at 0, you can add more contrast in post, but you can't pull it away. So you want to give like we've talked about, we want to give ourselves the most flexibility as we can in post. So if we're shooting with a neutral picture style with the contrast all the way down, we have the option to build more contrast if we want to. You just can't do it the other way around. If you've gone with a standard picture style and very high contrast and you want to lower the contrast, well, you pretty much can't and you're stuck with it. All right, if you're coming from a photography background, you might have heard the term shooting to the right, and that refers to the histogram. So give you an example, if we're looking at the histogram and these are our whites over here, basically they are saying shift everything to the right. And because we have these wonderful highlight recovery tools like in Lightroom, and you can use highlight recovery and get some of that information back. So in this case, if I went to, let's say, f7.1, that's too far, but I would be shooting like right here around f8. Well, in video mode, I would tend to say you want to be right in the middle, more like here, or actually this one is a little bit to the left. Now, if I were to move my lights just a few inches, I could probably nail it. So it's right in the middle. But the concept of shooting to the right really doesn't apply to us in the video world. We want to be a little bit on the safe side, if not right in the middle. All right, next up I want to demonstrate and kind of put it all together, the mathematical relationship in terms of like one-stop increments of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So let's start off with ISO. So if we hit our button, and all we've got to choose from in these Rebel line of cameras is one stop. So I could go, let's say I go down from 800 to 400. Well, that's one stop. And I could show you that it's, you can see the image got darker. And if you look at the meter, and again, this is center weighted average, and we've zoomed all the way into the neutral gray. So this is gonna be very accurate in terms of the meter. And you can see, sure enough, it's exactly one stop down. So if I hit the ISO button again, and 800 was where we're at neutral, and we go to 1600, we should be exactly one stop above, and sure enough, we're exactly one stop above. So let's go back down to 800. So ISO is tracking perfectly. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to do our aperture. So if we, again, hold the AV button in, and we click 3 times, because we're going to do a third of a stop each. 1, 2, 3. We've gone down to, down to F13, or gone up to F13 if you're thinking the actual number. And sure enough, it's exactly one stop. Now, if we do it the opposite way, 3, 1, 2, 3, and sure enough, we've increased it 2 stops to be one stop overexposed at F6.3. So let's go back and bring this back down to where it was. So now we're back down to neutral. Now we're going to do the shutter speed. Now we don't have to hold in the AV button. We're just going to use the main dial. And if we go 1, 2, 3, you'll notice it got 3 thirds of stop, or a full stop darker, because we've gone from 50th of a second to 100th of a second. And if we go the opposite direction, 1, 2, 3, we're back at the middle, and we go 1 and then 2. We can't do a third because it doesn't go down to like a 20th of a second. We can see we're exactly 2/3 of a stop up. So using this digital calibration target, you can see the relationships. So a lot of times, let's put this back to a 50th of a second. So a lot of times you're going to be in a situation where you're going to need to do things quickly. And you're going to say, I need another stop of light. How do I get it? Do I get it from changing the shutter speed? Which usually not. Do I get it from ISO? Yeah. Do I get it from aperture? Sure. Also, getting to know your lights. Like this light is about, 2 feet away from this digital calibration target. And knowing how to use your lights to say, well, if I'm at 2 feet away and I move it to 4 feet away, what does that do? Is that a one stop, or what exactly happens there? So there's going to be a lot of situations you need to move fast, and you're going to see the meter, and you see, oh, the meter's telling me I'm one stop below. Do I either move my lights closer, or do I change the f-stop, or do I change the ISO? So it's kind of knowing and going through this whole exercise and knowing what your camera is capable of in terms of bringing up and down the exposure. It will just help you move a lot quicker. All right, and our final tool that we have at our disposal for exposure is our eyes, and using the display on the back of the screen and using the 5x and 10x digital zoom. All right, so a lot of situations you're not going to have access to a grade card, you won't have time, it's just run and gun, and you want to get it is the best you can. So, if we look at the meter here, I'm just shooting one of my girl's dolls. I grabbed a doll out of my kids' collection. Don't worry, on the last chapter, we're going to actually have a live person, but the doll's great because she doesn't move and she doesn't complain. So for this demonstration, we're one stop too bright here because, center weighted average meter, it's taking into account some of this, the blown out highlights that are going on here off on the right-hand side of the frame where we have a window. And this is something you're going to run into a lot. But you don't want to go by the meter in this case. And if we look at the histogram, well, since we don't have a digital calibration target or anything, we can look at it and it is helpful. We can see that we do have some blown out highlights. That's fine, but that's really not helping us either. So again, in a run and gun situation, probably your best tool you have is your eye. So what I'm going to do is hit the zoom button once, twice, and 3 times. Now I'm zoomed all the way in, and you can focus, and we're going to talk about focus more later. So what we're going to do now is we're going to scroll around on her skin where we think it might be blown out. Obviously, a girl's, somebody's skin, the pores on the skin is going to look much different than plastic on a doll. But you get the idea that what you do is basically you move around, like I'm moving around on the jawline here, where I think the skin might get blown out. And what's great about this kind of exercise, there's a couple things going on. Is one, you're going to, be able to get the exposure where you want it. Because if you do, you start going around and you start to see like pores. You can't see the pores, but you can see it in another part of the face. Then you've blown out the highlights. Another situation where this is really good is, let's say you're doing an interview and you've got lights coming from down above. And let's say the person you're interviewing is nervous, getting sweaty. Maybe sweat is happening up on their forehead. And a lot of times the light's going to come down and you have those spectral highlights where the light's bouncing off and you're going to be blowing out those highlights. You could, wipe off the sweat off the guy's forehead, give him some powder and stuff like that. But by using that digital zoom, getting in close, you'll be able to see those type of things. Another thing is, like when I zoomed into the girl's eyes, and the first time I did it, I was like, well, they looked awfully dark. So I bumped up my softbox light that I have pointing at her, and that helped. So when you move around the image and you look at somebody's face in a very close way, you'll see some of those problem areas, and you might want to flag something off, relight something. It's just an awesome, awesome tool. In fact, I think it trumps the meter and it trumps the histogram. It's the one thing, the end result is looking at it and going around and, protecting those highlights and seeing if you've got the right exposure. So that's pretty much it for exposure. Exposure is really important. We're going to be talking about focus. Focus is probably the most important because you can't fix, focus problems later in post. Exposure issues you can fix to some degree. You want to get the exposure the best you can with these DSLR cameras, because if you don't, it's not like a still image where you have a lot of play where you can get the exposure where you want it. So definitely spend some time getting the exposure right. But next up, we'll be talking about focus pretty soon.